Welcome to the Liberty Baptist Sermon Archives. The message you're about to hear was preached at Liberty Baptist Church in Easton, Massachusetts. You can find out more about us or contact us at mylibertybaptist.org or just look us up on Facebook. And now we hope that this message from God's Word will be a blessing to you.
Why don't you turn your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 6 this evening. 1 Corinthians chapter number 6. This preacher is grateful to be out of 1 Corinthians chapter number 5, no doubt, and we are in 1 Corinthians chapter number 6. You know, when two people in the world argue about something, and maybe it gets a little bit heated, and maybe there's a little bit of a back and forth, it seems like the trump card that somebody wants to throw out, if they just want to kind of end the conversation, end the debate, they'll say something like this: well, you know what? I'll see you in court. You ever hear somebody say that? Maybe you've had to say that to somebody. I don't know. But you know, when there's some irreconcilable differences, what is the ultimate thing that you can say that will end the conversation and really kind of take it to the next level? It's something on these lines: I will see you in court. Now, you understand why the world does this, right? Because the world is, well, the world. The world used to do things on a handshake, used to be able to make an agreement with somebody just by looking them in the eye and shaking their hand. That's not the way it is anymore. Contracts are really written to be made to be broken more than anything, and the world is double dealing, and the world seeks inequitable justice. And when I mean inequitable, it means like more for me and less for you. You know, that's the way the world works, isn't it? They want more and they want you to have less. So we understand when the world deals with these kind of things, we know that the world, as I've said many times before, is going to act like the world. It shouldn't surprise us. But what happens when believers find themselves in the same position? And they can't handle conflict amongst themselves. And they find the only way that they can handle a conflict between them is to take one another to court. You say, Pastor, has that ever happened at Liberty Baptist Church? By God's grace, it has never happened at Liberty Baptist Church. But there is a church I know of that it has happened at before, and it's this: the church at Corinth. Boy, we've covered a laundry list of problems the church at Corinth has had, and it's not done yet, because Paul is going to address here in 1 Corinthians chapter number 6 the very grave issue of the church at Corinth taking one another to court. And so we're going to find this evening about why Paul explains that it's wrong, why Paul explains that it should not happen, and really a Christian shouldn't sue another Christian because Christians are supposed to be peacemakers. We're going to see that tonight, that we as Christians are called to be peacemakers. And if two people, I'm talking about two people within the confines of a church, are committed to being godly in a difficult situation, peace can be found. I'm not saying that aren't difficult situations that can happen in the life of a church. I'm not saying that there isn't someone that could be wronged within a church, whether it was for an accidental reason or maybe even for a purposeful reason. But I would say if two people are committed to being godly in the midst of a difficult situation, peace can be found. James 4, chapter 4, verse 1 says, "From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence, even of your lusts that war in your members?" So the question tonight is this: what happens when "I'll see you in church" ends up to be this: I'll see you in court? What happens when "I'll see you in church" ends up being "I'll see you in court"? We're going to see what Paul says about it here in 1 Corinthians here tonight. So you can remain seated. We're going to read the first 8 verses, 1 Corinthians chapter number 6. And it says this: "Dare any of you, having a matter against another, go to law before the unjust and not before the saints? Do ye not know that the saints shall judge the world? And if the world shall be judged by you, are ye unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Know ye not that we shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? If then ye have judgments of things pertaining to this life, set them to judge who are least esteemed in the church. I speak to your shame. Is it so that there is not a wise man among you? No, not one that shall be able to judge between his brethren. But if brother go to law with brother, and that before the unbelievers, now therefore there is utterly a fault among you, because ye go to law one with another. Why do ye not rather the wrong? Why do ye not rather suffer yourselves to be defrauded? Nay, ye do wrong and defraud, and that your brethren." Paul has launched a new attack this evening on a new area of ungodliness within the church at Corinth. We talked about wisdom and pride and arrogance and grouping themselves into different factions, pitting themselves against one another, all in the name of godliness, saying, I'm of Apollos and I'm of Paul. and I'm of Cephas, and I'm of Christ. We saw sexual immorality in chapter number 5. And now, here's the issue. Christians in the church at Corinth are taking one another to court. Now, let's be clear about something as we start here tonight. Paul was not at all against legal action. In fact, I would say this, as a Pharisee and as a Roman citizen, Paul was very aware of what his rights were. I can give you 3 examples this evening. You can bring that up here. Thank you. Oh, that's very nice. If you want to be really nice, you can get the clicker out of Dad's office because I forgot it, all right? So why don't you go do that? She says, I don't have to listen to the sermon? All right, no, you got to come back, all right? I'll give you 3 examples very quickly. Paul is in Philippi. He gets thrown into prison. Well, he's beaten first and then thrown into prison with Silas. Of course, we understand that God makes a miraculous jailbreak where Paul and Silas are able to be brought out with this earthquake, that they lead the jailer and his family to Christ. And the very next day, the magistrates come and they say, oh, you like the attention. All right, thank you very much. You can be seated. That big smile. All right. The magistrates say, hey, why don't you just go ahead and be released? We'll just let you go. And Paul says, no, I don't think so. He says, if the magistrates want us to be released, they can come into this jail and release us themselves. Now, why did he say that? Because he was a Roman citizen, and he was not supposed to be bound, he was not supposed to be beaten, and he was not supposed to be jailed as a Roman citizen without first having a trial. And so he knew his rights. You can go to Acts chapter number 22, and they were going to flog him in Jerusalem, and he said the same thing. He said, are you going to flog me? Are you going to beat me as a Roman citizen? And the man who was in charge all of a sudden got very afraid because he realized he shouldn't even have bound him, let alone being able to flog him as a Roman citizen. You can go to Acts chapter 25, and when Paul, dealing with the same legal issue, makes his appeal unto Caesar, he understands that the way he can get a free trip to Rome to be able to preach the gospel is just to make his appeal unto Caesar. No, Paul was very understanding of the legal system, and Paul was not making a blanket condemnation upon Christians understanding and partaking in the legal system in general. This is not an issue of a Christian foregoing all legal action. It's the impropriety of believers taking one another to court, particularly believers of the same church. It's important for Christians to settle disputes among themselves according to God's principles. This can be done through the church. This can be done through what I would call Christian arbitration, where an arbiter who is a Christian would be able to use Christian principles to be able to handle and settle differences between believers within a church. You say, well, is there some kind of Christian arbitration principle that we could use within the church? Well, we read it a couple weeks ago. It's Matthew 18. Go to the brother and talk to him. Then bring a witness. And then if necessary, bring it before the church. Yes, God has given us the way that Christians can handle problems within the assembly without having to take one another to small claims court. Paul does not say that Christians should not have their own system to handle criminal law. We're not talking about criminal law here tonight. You might have heard of Sharia law before and how Sharia law in Muslim countries will overtake the law system. It is the law. And I would say that as Sharia law goes into other nations that are not Muslim exclusive nations, that Sharia law desires to overtake the legal system in the nations of which it's implemented, whether that is in Great Britain, as it's been seen there, or even here in the United States of America. No, that's not some tinfoil hat conspiracy by a crazy independent Baptist preacher. That's just the fact of the matter of seeing what's happened in other places in the world, seeing what the Quran says, and not wanting it to be implemented in the United States. What I'm not saying is that we should have our own Christian criminal system where we are to take care of those things outside of what the parameters legally are for us here in our towns, here in our counties, here in our state, and with the federal government. In fact, quite the opposite. You can go to, in fact, turn there real quickly. Go to Romans chapter number 13. You've read this before, no doubt. It's just a few pages away. But it's important for us to look at this again. Romans chapter number 13. It's appropriate for the state to handle criminal cases. However, Christians among themselves should be able to handle civil matters. Look at Romans 13, verse 1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Paul's saying this, there's no authority that can be in place without God allowing it. You say, well, Pastor, there's some really wicked leaders that are around the world, and we've had wicked leaders even in our own nations at times and places. And the answer to that is yes. But what I'm telling you tonight is this, is that none of that caught God by surprise. There is none of that where God in heaven said, this is not the election returns I thought would happen. I didn't know these hanging chads would be there. God was not surprised by any of these things. No. God is aware. God is in control. Look at verse 2. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou not then be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Now, Paul is writing this about the wicked Roman Empire. You realize this is when this is being written. He's writing it about the Roman Empire. And what he is saying is that when the system is as it ought to be, what is the government supposed to do? It is supposed to punish the bad, and it's supposed to reward the good. You say, well, Pastor, it doesn't seem like the government always does that. When the government doesn't do that, who's ultimately in control? The Lord is in control. The Lord is the one that will reckon those accounts when they're wrong. But I will say this, unless the government is telling us to do something that is patently unbiblical, what are we to do? Well, we are to obey the government. It says this, verse 5, wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. If I could maybe summarize all of this in a way that I know would biblically help us to understand, it would be this: render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and render unto God what is God. You find that in Matthew, you find it in Mark, and you find it in Luke, where Jesus tells the Pharisees when they tried to entrap him, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God. Listen, we don't like hearing this, but we need to obey the government. But listen, take a time out. When the government tells us to do something that is patently unbiblical, when the government says, do something that's in violation of the Word of God, what do the disciples say in the book of Acts? We ought to obey God rather than man. As Christians, one of the ways we can have a good testimony is by obeying the government. But also, we need to have a testimony that we will follow God first before we follow man. But here, there's nowhere where we see that we are to eschew the legal system, to stay away from the criminal legal system, and that we are to make sure that what are we supposed to do when it comes to civil matters, to disagreements? What are we supposed to do? Handle it amongst yourselves and don't take each other to court. That's what the world does to each other. But we as believers, we ought to be able to handle within the body the problems that we have within the body. We'll look more about why that is in a second. But another thing I want to say, and I want to make this very clear tonight, churches have no business hiding criminal activity under the guise of 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Churches should not and are not allowed to hide criminal activity because of what it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And you can turn back there if you want to, because we'll look more at that in a second. But I will say there have been times in the past where there have been churches who have taken things, for instance, like sexual abuse, and have tried to hide it under the carpet. Why? Under the guise of, well, the church is supposed to handle the issues within the church. Listen to me, and listen to me very carefully tonight. There is no biblical basis for any type of activity like that. There is no biblical basis for the church to hide any type of sexual misconduct that takes place within the church in any type of criminal way and to say, well, the church is going to handle it. No. What do? Romans chapter 13, you let the powers take care of it that God has instituted and God has ordained. I can take you to a campus in Jacksonville, Florida, where a pastor for years and years molested up to 300 different young people. 300. Now, whether that can be verified, I don't know. But I do know this, that there was an admission of guilt that took place later. But this happened when this man was in his 80s. The church found out about this in the mid-1990s. They found out about many allegations. And they decided that this pastor should resign and then go on to the mission field in Germany, where he would be away from the legal system in the United States. And everyone thought, isn't it great that this pastor, he's about at retirement age, he's going to go to Germany and become a missionary, not knowing that that church was trying to hide the misconduct that was taking place. There's only one word that I can use to categorize that behavior, and it's this: it's wicked. There is no biblical basis for that whatsoever. Hear me, and hear me clearly tonight. Why could we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and see how clearly God dealt with those kind of issues and then be so blasé about it in 1 Corinthians chapter 6? No, this doesn't make sense. So Paul told the Corinthians that they should not sue one another. Why was that? Well, there's three main reasons for that. And first of all, it's this. Number one, it's an issue of trust. It's an issue of trust. Look back at verse number 1, and Paul uses some very strong language here. He says, dare any of you? It's almost like he's saying, how dare you do this? What are you thinking? As some people would say around these parts, what's the matter with you? How dare you? Dare any one of you, having a matter against another, go to the law before the unjust and not before the saints? When he says a matter against another, he's talking about the brethren. Why would you go to the law before the unjust? And the unjust here are talking about the unsaved. And so Paul is basically asking this: why would you seek the opinion of someone who is not just? If you are looking for justice and you're a believer, why would you go to the unjust? Why would you go to the unsaved? Wouldn't it make more sense to be able to find the wisdom that should be found within the local body? Listen, there is no justice to be found with the unsaved. And listen, I'm not saying every judge is crooked. I'm not saying every court is crooked. Again, we just read Romans chapter 13. We're supposed to have respect for the system as we find it. But just as a matter of principle, the unjust are going to be unjust. The unsaved are going to think like the unsaved. It's not that they can't think of truth, and it's not that they can't act on truth, but when they think of truth and they act on truth, where do they get it from? The father of lies? They've stumbled upon it from God and God himself. And so we see that he says this: how dare you? How could you possibly be believers and go to the unsaved to try to settle your own matters? It's not that there can't be good judges, but just as a general principle, why would you do this? What would you be thinking? And so he says a couple different things about that. First of all, he says that the fact that you would go to the unsaved is an indictment against the brethren. It's an indictment against the brethren. The fact that two believers couldn't hash out their differences in a godly way is an indictment against them. In fact, verse number 5, he asks this question: I speak to your shame. Is it so that there is not a wise man among you? And I find that ironic, and the reason that I do is because when it says, is there not a wise man among you? Well, what did he talk to them about a few chapters ago? They all thought that they were wise. And so it's kind of like, what are you doing? I thought you all thought you were wise, and now you can't handle your own situations within the church. He says, no, these things ought not to be. Believers, it says in verses number 2 and 3, do you not know that the saints shall judge the world, and that the world shall be judged by you? Are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Know ye not that we shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? Now, did that catch your attention when we read through that the first time? The fact that we as believers will someday be judge of the angels. And again, when it says the saints, understand we're talking about biblical doctrine. We're not talking about that Catholic group of people. No, what are we talking about? We're talking about those who are believers. The day you were saved was the day you became a saint. It may seem strange to you, but that's the way that it is biblically. All the epistles start with, to the saints that are at Galatia, to the saints that are in Rome, to the saints that are at over and over and over again. So it says the saints shall judge the world, and that they will judge angels. Now, what could that be talking about? Now, I believe that when it's talking about this, it's talking about, first of all, that there will be believers as judges during the millennial kingdom, but also that believers will sit in judgment of the fallen angels at the very end times. Now you say, why would you say that? Well, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12 says, if we suffer, we shall also reign with him. We deny him, he will also deny us. There will be a time for believers, then we will reign, where we will have some level of judgment. Now, I'm not saying that we will be the judges, but we will stand in judgment along with the righteous judge, who is Jesus Christ. Daniel chapter 7 verse 22, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. That says that there will be judgment that takes place in the millennial reign, and I believe judgment that takes place before those fallen angels are taken and cast in the lake of fire. So what's the end result of all of this? God's saying, if you're going to be able to judge those things for eternity, you can't handle the situations you have in your church now. If you're going to have that type of responsibility later, shouldn't you be doing this now? You have high and holy work ahead of you. Why would you not be able to handle your business now? It would be like having two Supreme Court justices that got into a quarrel with one another, and the only way they could settle it was going on people's court. Dun, 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 could you imagine, in walks in Justice, so-and-so. Could you imagine, you'd say, these two are supposed to be, at the very height of the legal system of the United States of America, and the only way they can settle their dispute is in small claims court on television? You'd say, that's crazy. That's the best that I can tell you is the comparison here in verses number 2 and 3. Paul's saying, listen, you realize the high and holy calling of judgment that is ahead of you if you're a believer? He says, and you're going to the courts at Corinth to try to get clarity about the situations that you're having with each other? What's the matter with you? It's an indictment against you as brethren. What's the matter with you that you would think that way? The fact that the church would need the world to solve their problems is an indictment about how un-Christ-like they were. But it wasn't just that it was an indictment against the brethren, but we also see that it was an invitation to worldly thinking. An invitation to worldly thinking. The fact that the just would think they need counsel, advice, or wisdom from the unjust is an invitation to worldly thinking in a host of other areas. Look at verse number 6. But brother goeth to law with brother, and that before the unbelievers. He's saying, why would you invite the counsel and the wisdom of the unbelievers in your life? Now, you'd say, the wisdom of the unbelievers? Well, yes. Consider James chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. But if you have bitter envy and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not against the truth. This wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly and sensual and devilish. He's saying, why would you invite the world's counsel into your life? Why would you ask the world for advice on how you live your life? Listen, the world doesn't have the answers. The world is the problem. The world is on fire. It's like asking an arsonist how to set up a fire extinguisher in your home. It's like trying to ask a thief how you should set up a safe in a bank. Why on earth would you ask the world? And I'm not saying that everybody in the world is out to get you. I'm not saying that everybody in the world has this bend against you to try to take you down. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying the world system as it is set up, the world system, that the head of it is Satan himself, the father of lies, the one who seeks to kill and steal and destroy. No, he has set it up that he has no wisdom. And when the world, again, does have wisdom, it's because they have accidentally co-opted from God, because God is the God of truth. All truth flows from him, and the world speaks truth. They're just speaking God's truth. And again, I'm not saying that the world can never speak truth. I'm just saying that when the world speaks truth, it's not because the world produced the truth, it's because they stumbled upon God's truth. And Paul counters this worldly thinking because he says this. He says, you know what, if you're going to have a judge, if you're going to take care of some issues in the body, you know who should be your judge? Did you catch that? Look at what it says again. It says in verse number 4, if then ye have judgments of things pertaining to this life, set them to judge who are least esteemed in the church. Now, what does the world say? The world says we need the most esteemed. We need the one with the highest credentials. What does Paul say? Well, get the one that's the least esteemed. We're not talking about the least character. We're talking about someone who is maybe not as regarded as everyone else, but that still is a godly person. And it's a reminder, Luke 13:10, this is not worldly wisdom, this is godly wisdom. The last shall be first, and there are first which shall be last. So what do? You take someone who maybe is not the most popular, but has the Spirit of God, and what do? You allow them to be the judge. I remember back at Westgate, there was a man named James Clayton, and Brother Clayton is one of my favorite men there, him and his wife, Miss Sandra. And Brother Clayton ended up being a deacon at Westgate, and I'd sit in deacons meetings sometimes just as an assistant pastor if there was something that I needed to help deal with in the church. You know, the thing I loved about Brother Clayton, well, I don't know if I say I love this about him, but the thing that was interesting about Brother Clayton is he almost never talked. I shouldn't say I love that about a person, right? But the thing that was interesting about him was he almost never talked. I would say in many ways he was maybe one of the least esteemed in the church because he didn't have this outgoing, gregarious personality. Now, the funny thing was he was an Army drill sergeant, so I guess he got it all out in his younger years. But I will tell you this about James Clayton. When he talked, you listened. He didn't waste his words. When he said something, everyone's ears perked up. He may only say something at that deacon's meeting 2 or 3 times, but every time he did, he was listening to what was going on and made a contribution that was filled with wisdom and God's word in it. And when I think of the least esteemed among you, I think of James Clayton. Not that he was little regarded in the church, but the idea if you just walked into the church and you said, we need someone to settle a dispute, you'd see someone who maybe was gregarious in their personality and that was maybe a little bit boisterous, and you maybe say, man, this is the person that everyone needs to listen to. There's James Clayton sitting in the background. He's serving. He's not serving out in front of everybody. He may have been least regarded in some ways, but I'll tell you this, there's a lot of wisdom in that man. The world wouldn't agree with that, but in God's kingdom, it's quite the opposite. So don't think worldly when it comes to these issues. What do? We need to make sure that we think the way that God wants us to think. And this is a reminder to us tonight, and I really want you to consider this tonight, that the center of wisdom in your life ought to be the local church. I know that sounds crazy, but follow me for a second. The center of wisdom in your life ought to be your local church. Why? Well, this text makes clear here that we ought to be a place where differences can be resolved. We ought to be a place where direction can be found. That's why we're not supposed to go it alone as believers. You need a church body where we can help one another, where you have disputes, but disputes can be settled in a way that is better and more godly than how the world settles disputes. This is why we're not supposed to go it alone as believers. And the world should not be your go-to. The world should be something that's avoided. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. But the church should be your go-to for wisdom. I'm not saying that churches are perfect, but I will say this. We have a perfect book. We have a perfect spirit who lives inside of us. We ought to be able to be different in how we handle these issues. Boy, I got to move faster than this, all right? Number 2. It's not just an issue of trust. Number 2, it's an issue of testimony. It's an issue of testimony. If you were to take this text as a whole here tonight, particularly verses 6 through 8, let me ask you this. What kind of testimony is it for a church of believers to be able to go before an unbelieving judge and then accuse one another? Do you think they'd be able to give them a tract when it's done? I know they weren't given tracts back then, but you understand the thought process of that. Would they be in a place after accusing one another? Well, this guy did this to me. Well, I'll tell you what, this guy's a scumbag. Well, you know what? You're a double scumbag, you know? And they're going back and forth, and by the time they're done, they're saying, oh, by the way, Judge, if you have nowhere to go to church on Sunday, we'd love to be able to invite you to Corinth Baptist Church. And the judge said, you know what? I get enough of this out in the world. I think I'm good. Thank you very much. It's an issue of testimony. There ought to be harmony within the church of God. Why? Because the world ought to see that the church ought to act like the church. The world ought to be able to see that we as believers can walk in the way that we say that we're going to walk. And again, I know we're not perfect. I don't want to set us up for failure here tonight, but there ought to be something different about us as believers. There ought to be something different about the way we look, the way we act, the way we talk, the way we think, and there ought to be something different about the way we handle conflict. And there ought to be something different. We ought to be peacemakers, and that's why he didn't want them to go to court, because even when there were real issues, and there could be real issues, they needed to be handled in a biblical way. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Meaning this, that they see you, they don't want to appreciate what you're doing, but you are walking in such a way that is what the Lord wants you to do, that they can't argue with how you're living. You can't do that if you're suing each other in court. Philippians 2:15, that you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke, in the midst of a wicked and crooked and perverse generation, a nation among whom ye shine as lights in the world. I've given the example before many years ago when I was a teenager, and I was working with a young man at McDonald's named Kevin. It was my first job. Only worked there for a few months. Making $5 an hour, big money. I mean, big money. You know what I'm saying? At the McDonald's, I was working in the front. Kevin was working in the back. And we were excited because our youth group was coming. Our youth group was going to come that night. Now, we were working, so we didn't come to the youth department that night on a Friday night. But they were going to come, and I thought, man, what a great way for us to be able to show the people that we work with about what it's like to be a Christian and about our church. It would be so much easier to invite the other teenagers we were working with at the church, to church. It would be a great thing. Can I tell you, my friends trashed that McDonald's. They absolutely trashed it. And I'm not saying on accident, they did it on purpose. And part of the reason was they wanted to kind of have a go at me and Kevin. But here's the thing, Kevin was cooking the hamburgers in the back. He wasn't going to clean it. So there's only one who was going to clean it, and that was me. But you know who saw the mess? Every single person that we had been talking to about our church coming. And I had so wished that instead of telling them I was from Westgate Baptist Church, I had so wished I had told them that I was from Incarnation Catholic Church that was right up the road instead. Like, why did I tell them I was from Westgate? Because it left such a bad impression. My manager was ticked off. My manager was upset. Listen, how we react as believers makes an impact in the world. How we make an impact as believers amongst ourselves makes an impact in the world when the world comes into this building. I'm going to take this a little bit further here for a moment, all right? We pray that the world comes to this building to be able to hear the gospel message. That's the plan. That's why we hand out tracts. That's why I invite people to church, because we want people that don't know Jesus Christ to come to church to find what we have. I mean, that's kind of what we want to do, particularly at this kind of time of year. But listen, if the world comes in here and finds people that are not in harmony, they're going to leave and say, I can get this anywhere. You know what they ought not to see when they come into a church setting? They ought not to see people quarreling with one another. You know what the world ought to see when they come into a church setting? Not see people divided into cliques and groups. You know what they ought to see when they come into a church building? They ought to see people who are as interested in seeing them as they are in seeing the person that they talk to every Sunday and every Wednesday. You say, this is a little bit of a stretch from the text. I know that it is to a point, but there's an application here that's real. That when we come in contact with the world, they ought to see us acting like believers. And when two guys are in a courtroom fighting with each other and they both say they're Christians and an unsaved judge says, what's going on? It's no different than the world coming in here because we've invited them, so they expect us to act like believers, and then we don't act like believers when they come into this assembly. What do we need to do? It's an issue of our testimony. Galatians 6:10 tells us, as we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them that are a household of faith. We should be doing right by each other. We should do right to the people in the world that don't always do right by us. As a church, we are to be a shining light to the world. So it's an issue of trust. It's an issue of testimony. Number 3, it's an issue of tactlessness. It's an issue of tactlessness. What does it mean, tactlessness? Well, having tact is an adeptness at dealing with difficult issues. Meaning this, the church at Corinth showed they didn't know how to handle difficult issues. They didn't know how to handle these issues where believers were supposed to act like believers. And verses number 7 and 8 give an interesting thought that is very contrary to our flesh. Look at what it says. Now therefore, there is utterly a fault among you, because ye go to law one with another. Why do ye not rather take wrong? Why do you not rather suffer yourselves to be defrauded? Nay, ye do wrong and defraud, and that your brethren. So he says this in verse 8, listen, if you've defrauded your brethren, that's wrong. But he also looks at the ones who are defrauded, and he says this, listen, if you are going to court and you're willing to take this to court, wouldn't it be better to take a, quote, loss than to be able to go to court and maybe win your pound of flesh, but you really haven't won the battle at all. In fact, you've made things worse because of your testimony. One commentator put it this way. I couldn't say it better than he said, so I just want to read it. Paul called this man to do something hard, to give up what he deserved for the higher good of God and his kingdom. But the man who was wronged should not think Paul was asking him to take a loss. Yeah, that's why I said a loss. He was not asking him to take a loss. No one who accepts wrong for the sake of God's glory will be a loser. No one who accepts wrong for the sake of God's glory will be a loser. Paul didn't say the problem shouldn't be handled, but he was saying if the church couldn't handle it as the last resort, the church should be the last resort and not the world. If the church could not handle it for whatever reason, take a loss. Because you're really not taking a loss. Because who is the one that handles reaping and sowing? God. You should be willing to be defrauded. No, you say, well, that makes me look like a sucker. No, that's not what we're trying to say at all. We're saying this, when you get in those situations and it's at the very most desperate situation and the other person is not being godly, the other person is not doing what they should, the other person's not being a peacemaker, are you willing to take a loss and know this, that God will take vengeance for them and that God will repay me for being faithful? I'll say this, our flesh don't like that kind of talk. You know what I like? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And you got to say it like that because that's how they said in the Old Testament, right? Actually, that's how they said in the West, more like it. But even the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was a law of equitability and equitable punishment. It was not a law of vengeance. In fact, it was a law to keep men from taking vengeance against one another. And that commentator continues and he says, ideally, the church should have settled the dispute. But if the church failed to do so, Paul asked the man to trust in God, not in secular judges and lawsuits and courts. See, that doesn't make any sense. Well, in our economy, it doesn't. But in God's economy, losing is often winning. We see that so many times, don't we? We already said the last shall be first and the first shall be last. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 10, Paul said, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake, for when I am weak, then am I strong. Matthew 16, verse 25, for whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall save it. That it would be better to be defrauded and trust the Lord that He will be able to repay you far more full than whatever you would have achieved in court, but whatever would have been lost in the testimony of those unsaved people who watched you hash it out in front of them. Said you would be better to take an L. You'd be better to take an L and know that God will repay you back far more than what the world can. We've dealt with this before. I've told the story before where our family was in the place where our church wasn't paying us and we were on salary back at Westgate. I don't know the exact amount of checks we were behind. I think I've said the number before, but I don't know exactly. But I know that we were somewhere about $6,000 behind in our pay. And that would have represented about a third of year's salary for me back in 2008, 2009. It's a large amount. There was a lot of heartburn that went along with that. I'm not blaming anybody for what happened. I'm just saying that's what happened. It's a building program that went wrong with a lot of bad decisions that took place during that time. And it would have been easy for me to just go to a small claims court and say, you know what? This is what I'm deserved. This is what I'm owed. No one could argue. No one could argue. The contract was such that the money that I was supposed to receive was what I was supposed to receive. The hours that I worked were certainly equal to what I was supposed to, if not more than what I was supposed to. And it would be very easy for us to say, you know what? Give it to me or I'll sue. What do? Well, some who were in that situation, the Lord led them to different places to leave, and they left quietly. For us, we felt we didn't have the liberty to be able to leave. We prayed about it and just never felt it was right. But when the time came, a new regime came in and things started to get better, but that back pay seemed like it was gone. They were trying to repay, but they were paying it like $100 every month or something like that. At that rate, I'd be collecting Social Security by the time it was all finished, But we went on deputation, that process where we left Westgate preparing to come here, and we went from church to church to church. And can I tell you that when the churches that we went to, that God provided over and over and over again, to the point that when we got to Liberty, when we got ready to start the church, we could not believe how the Lord had financially blessed. It was incredible. To the point that I got on the phone about a month before the church started and called Pastor Pert. Pastor Pert was not the one who accrued the debt. Pastor Pert was the one who was trying to fix the debt. And I'm thankful for him to try to do that. But we called him, and Diane and I prayed about it. We said, Pastor Pert, this debt's not yours, and it's holding Westgate back. So we want you to know we forgive the church of the debt. You say, well, wasn't that big of you? I'm not saying it because it's big of me. What I'm saying is this: God paid back with interest. And every time we've had a difficulty over the years that we've been here, and there have been times of difficulty. I've told you I've worked for Uber before, and I've done different kinds of odd jobs to be able to make things meet. But I would tell you this: I go back to that, and I always remember God provided. And when you're in a situation where you feel like, well, am I being defrauded by someone in the church? I loaned someone some money and they didn't give it back. There was a situation where I did work for somebody and it didn't seem like it worked out the way that it was supposed to. We were in business together and it didn't. Listen, let it go to God. Try to take care of it. Oh, absolutely try to take care of it. But when it gets to the point that your only remedy is going to court, just know this: there's a higher court than any court that Bristol County has. There's a higher court than anything this state has. There's a higher court than the so-called Supreme Court has. You know what that is? There's a God in heaven who makes things equitable and makes things right. I don't have time to go here, but there, Philippians chapter 4. Yeah, we'll go there. All right, just give me 2 minutes. All right, Philippians chapter 4. I want to read this and we'll be done. Philippians chapter 4. Say, Pastor, what does this have to do with me? I mean, I'm not planning on suing anybody. And my answer is, sure you are. That's why I'm preaching it, right? Somebody wants to sue somebody around here, right? No, I'm just kidding. No, nobody wants to sue anybody. I get that. But here's the principle. What are we supposed to be in the church? Peacemakers. You know what? I'm not concerned about people suing each other at Liberty Baptist Church. You know what I am concerned about? People that get crossways with one another and can't handle it biblically. He says, does that happen in church? How long you been in church? Yeah, it happens in church. And it requires two people, not just one, two people that are willing to act in a godly way to be able to handle that. But look at what it says in Philippians chapter 4. That this is not a question of somebody suing each other, but it is a question of division and strife in a church. Therefore, my brethren, dearly beloved and longed for, my joy and crown, so stand fast in the Lord, my dearly beloved. I beseech Eodias and beseech Syntyche that they be of the same mind in the Lord. These are two women in the church that are fighting with one another. It says, I entreat thee also, true yokefellow, help these women which labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and with other my fellow laborers whose names are in the book of life. These two women are in conflict with one another. What it was, we don't know. What it was about, we don't know. They were in conflict with one another. And Paul said this, he gave them two principles to deal with conflict, and they are this, and I'm giving you quickly, and we're done. The first is this: involve the flock. Involve the flock, by the way, in a scriptural way. I'm not talking about going around and gossiping. Because what did he say in verse number 3? He says, I entreat thee also, true yokefellow, help these women which labored with me in the gospel. Those yokefellow were the believers that were there. They were supposed to help together. He says, help these women. Invoke the flock, or involve the flock, but also invoke the future. Because it says at the end, it says, whose names are in the book of life. Listen, we're going to have to get along in heaven. I mean, we're going to be there and it's going to be perfect. We're going to have to get along in heaven. We might as well start now. What do we need to remember? Hey, involve the flock in a scriptural right way. If there's strife, Matthew 18 says, bring someone else in as long as you do it in the right way. But what do you need to do? Remember the future. Invoke the future. Remember, hey, we're going to live together for all eternity in a place that's perfect. We ought to get along with each other now. What happens when I'll see you at church turns out to be I'll see you in court? What do? Well, you end up reminding yourself that blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the ones that God will bless, and that is what we're to be within the church.
Thank you for listening to this sermon from the pulpit of Liberty Baptist Church. If this message was a blessing to you, or if there's any way we can serve you, please let us know by contacting us at info@mylibertybaptist.org, or you can visit us this Sunday at 800 Washington Street in Easton, Massachusetts. May the Lord bless you as you grow in His Word.